This is Monica Perez with a returning guest today, Jeremy Kuzmarov, author of 4 books on U.S. foreign policy, including The Russians Are Coming Again, the first Cold War as tragedy, the second as farce, which I think definitely plays into one of the topics we're going to cover today. He is the managing editor of Covert Action magazine. Jeremy and his team are keeping us apprised of the real stories behind the biggest events of the day. And as much as I respect Jeremy and his work, however, our ideologies are completely different. Jeremy thinks government's legit. I've given up on the state completely. But in a post ideological world of corruption and collusion, people of principle can still find common ground. So, welcome, Jeremy. Thank you for going on this search for common ground with me.
It's great to be with you.
How are you doing?
Pretty good. Thank you.
So I think we haven't spoken since December before your fundraiser, which I hope was successful. Didn't you have a good fun fundraiser in New York?
Yeah, we had a great time, and yeah, we're starting to, I think, build the name brand for the Covert Action magazine, and yeah, we're looking for new writers. So if any of our viewers here, we can use all the support we can get as far as writers, financial support. Anything that you might be able to help us with. And I think, yeah, I mean, the corporate, media has failed the public, and we're an independent media outlet, and even a lot of alternative media, are compromised. And like these issues, that we'll be discussing today, you really can't trust them. They often, have either been infiltrated by intelligence agencies, or they're advancing, or they're intimidated or something, and they're not willing to probe into the truth. And like we'll be discussing the shoot down of the MH17 Malaysian airliner. And if you're reading the mainstream media, you would have the indication that the Russians were behind it, when there's a ton of evidence to indicate that that's not the case. So this is just one example of why we need outlets like Covert Action magazine. We need a radiocaster like Monica to be widely heard, because we're people who are seeking the truth, and we're not compromised and bought off by corporations.
Yeah, that's the
Intelligence
thing.
agencies.
I've been basically trying to separate even people who journalists or media outlets who purport to tell the truth. There are limited hangouts out there, and there are disinformation agents out there. There are fake whistleblowers and all this. And I have I think most of the time I'm right, and most of the time I think everything is fake. And I've been right most of the time. So it's hard for me to find even outlets that say that they're digging into the deeper truth and find that they really are. And I do with Covert Action, especially. I mean, I'm an avid reader of your articles, and I really can never find fault with them. And I will say this MH17 story in particular demonstrates something that I think is valuable and being lost, which is I followed the MH17 story at the time. I followed the MH370 story, which was right before that, which I think was a real accident that was covered up. And they used the taint of the Malaysian Airlines to choose, because I think MH17 was a false flag, to choose Malaysia Airlines after the MH370 thing. And I was following the Ukrainian coup that the US perpetrated against the democratically elected government there in 2014. But with the MH17 story at the time, there were so many different details. It was very hard for me to really understand what the truth was. Like one thing that you go into, which is absolutely the essential fact, is people are saying it was a Buke missile from the ground, or it was an air-to-air missile, or somebody was shot down. What happened to MH17? And in real time, I couldn't figure it all out. But now when I read, you revisited it because finally, and I loved this expression, the show trial, the Dutch judge they came to a conclusion. That's what we want to talk about today. But you go back and you lay out all the facts, and that's history. This is how history is really written and preserved. You take the real-time events, you try to figure it out. You are, on the one hand, you have to play the role of a newspaper, but you also, because nobody, although you do cite a couple of books that are absolutely historical or an attempt at very recent history, which is tricky. In this particular case, I think you refer to a Dutch book, and the other guy, was he American. I think he was American. The book that you kind of opened with referring to. And so I think it's really important to go back and like say, okay, now we know what the facts are and lay it out in a historical sense because it's so important what they were trying to accomplish then and the groundwork in the background of people's minds that this established for what's happening today. Why it's so easy for them to say Russia's all at fault because they'll refer to things like, well, you remember MH17? It's like, wait, we got to go back. So why is this back in the news?
Well, yeah, and on your points, yeah, I mean, history is often written by the victor. So, unfortunately, a lot of the history is very biased, and it took me a long time to learn that. Yeah, because I was a history major and history professor, and then I faced a lot of pushback, even in the history profession, for some of the things I was writing or teaching. And I came to that understanding that history is indeed written by the victor, and the real history is often suppressed, and you sometimes really have to look for that history, but it's there, and the truth is out there for anyone who wants to look at it. Yeah, and in this case, well, I mean, this case is in the news again because there was a trial. There were three. There were three people. No, two were convicted, and one was the one person because the Dutch trial occurred for the shoot down that occurred in I forget the date now. It was July 17, 2014 was the date of this terrible airplane crash. The Malaysian airline jet MH17 was struck down, over 200 people killed. And then this trial took place, but of course, a Russian colonel, Igor Girkin, was convicted in absentia, as well as Sergei Dubinsky, and they're both part of the Donetsk People's militia. And then Oleg Pulatov was acquitted, and he was the only defendant to employ an attorney. But the trial was like a show trial. I mean, they include as legitimate evidence provided by Ukraine and by the United States, but they didn't accept any Russian evidence. So what kind of a trial is that? And they weren't even there. The defendants were not there. They thought it was a farce. And I mean, the defendants. It was never even alleged that these defendants were the ones who actually launched the missiles. They were the ones fingered because they allegedly helped supplying it. But there are some major studies, and my article basically summarizes a lot of what's been written by investigators. And I would give major credit to John Helmer, who's
That's it. Yeah.
yeah, he's an American who's worked in Russia for many years, and we're as an independent journalist, and he published a whole long book on the MH17, and he's written a lot of articles about it on his website. And Kees van der Pil is a Dutch
Yes.
scholar who wrote a very important book. And then Robert Parry, the late Robert Parry, was the head of Consortium News, which is a good alternative news site. And he did some important investigations, and he even interviewed American intelligence analysts. He's passed away, unfortunately, but yeah, he was really a great investigative journalist, and he really sets a great standard for journalism. It's sadly, I mean, I think he used to like in the '80s, he helps to expose the Iran-Contra affair and the drug trafficking by the CIA, and like he was writing for mainstream news sources at that time, but the media landscape has shifted since the '80s. But yeah, his work was very important because he did some interviews with a few U.S. Intelligence analysts who spoke, I guess, anonymously, but they confirmed a lot of what the Russians were saying, and Russian were pointing out about how the Russians could not be culpable for this. And I mean, the
Yeah.
evidence, yeah, if you want me to summarize it,
Well, one thing you said that they were only allowing the Dutch and American, was it Ukrainian and American information, but they also, I believe it was, who was it that kept anyone other than the Americans out, was it the Ukrainian intelligence actually kept Dutch investigators out of the scene?
Well, Malaysia, yeah, one thing, I mean, Malaysia, it was a Malaysian airline, so Malaysian government was obviously intent on finding out what happened, but the Malaysian leader at the time, Mahathir, who was more of an independent leader, he was completely excluded, from the investigation. I mean, that was totally unethical and showed, something was wrong here, why they totally excluded him, and he didn't believe it for a second. The official narrative. And it should be noted, one thing that's really fishy in this case is that the Americans have claimed, like John Kerry went on TV a couple days after the crash to claim that there was a satellite imagery that proved that Russia was behind it, but that imagery has never been released. And they refused, so only allegedly he's the only one who's ever seen it.
I
So
remember his
how can you
lies at
believe
that
that? Yeah,
time were outrageous. And it was like, and I was reminded this in your article, it was like at that time there was this world tour. Like, I don't know if he was going to other countries or just every news outlet or what, saying stuff like that and stuff like, just look at social media. You can piece together what happened over there. I mean, they were really trying to build up to something, if I'm not mistaken. And it didn't seem to have taken flight at that time in the way that they maybe had their highest aspirations. But his lies to me were outrageous at the time, totally without evidence and just blatant, straight faced lies from, he was the Secretary of State, right?
correct. Yeah, and I mean it's sad. I mean Kerry, if you followed his career, he emerged as a spokesman against the Vietnam War. He served in Vietnam, and he gave this eloquent speech before Congress. About how the leaders of the United States had betrayed the young men of his generation who were shipped off to Vietnam. A very eloquent speech, and I mean he was condemning the lies of Robert McNamara, and now he's become Robert McNamara. I
Yes,
mean,
right. And
and
and he and Biden, they were vice president and secretary of state at the time, not respectively, and their sons were both in that group of four in the financial organization that had Whitey Bulger's nephew, Devin Archer, who was convicted of corruption, and Hunter Biden and Chris Hines,
yeah, I think it was
who's
Carrie's stepson
Carrie's
or something.
stepson,
Yeah,
right? The four of them are in a financial group that benefited greatly, or at least was elbow deep in Ukraine as well as China. And I feel like those guys, it's hard to separate in that case. It's so obvious that there was personal, or I should say, I'm always looking for the hidden reasoning, the hidden agenda, the big globalist plot, the world domination plot. But when I look at the Ukraine stuff, which has those elements, I also see in Kerry and Biden these like personal corruptions that are big money, but it feels like, man, you can trace like the IMF money, the Burisma money to the Kolomoisky, the media empire, and now Zelensky, who was made a TV star and ultimately president at Kolomoisky's media empire. Like the actual financial benefit from these maneuverings is really distasteful. I almost would rather they had something more grand in mind, like controlling the world, but it's like they're in it for their own pockets as well.
yeah. Well, and one thing about Carrie, I knew a lot of Vietnam veterans. I was doing research on the Vietnam War and soldiers and drugs in Vietnam. So I interviewed, and I was living in Massachusetts, and this was at the time Carrie was running for president in 2004. And I knew a lot of people I interviewed with met were part of Vietnam Veterans Against the War, and they knew Carrie very well, but they all really disliked him. They felt he was very self-serving, and that he used the platform he had as an anti-war spokesman just to advance his own career. And then when he got into the Senate, representing Massachusetts, he totally abandoned the causes that those veterans continued to support, including anti-war causes, because a lot of those veterans were supporting the Iraq Veterans Against the War group and trying to organize against the Iraq War, and also supporting veterans issues. And Kerry just long abandoned them. So that's the kind of person he is. And
Yeah, that
unfortunately,
is ironic. I didn't really truly piece together that he was there in Ukraine fomenting war for, plunder and oil and gas
Yeah.
and lying and death and false flags and back dealing and all of that. And that is really exactly what he built his career on, fighting. And that's really cynical. Like, that's a really bummer
Yeah,
because
and
it's
it's
very
unfortunate.
admirable. Yeah.
Yeah, I've studied in some depth the career of some leading political figures. Yeah, especially in the Democratic Party, because as we've discussed, yeah, my leaning are more on the liberal side. As far as like the New Deal type program that I would support, but these liberals, just betray the party, and it's the same kind of cynical people who always get to the top. And I guess it's these kind of corrupt, immoral people who have no compunction about lying through their teeth about something like a plane crash, claiming that they have evidence, they have the satellite imagery, but nobody else could see it, so only we could know the truth. I mean, they're hiding. What are they hiding? If they claim to have the smoking gun evidence, present it, and they were asked by the judge to present it, and they didn't. The satellite imagery that Kerry had claimed some years earlier, and they made some excuse for why they couldn't present it. And then apparently there was some kind of deal that the Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte had struck with Obama administration, basically to cover this up. That's what Helmer presents as to why the judge accepted this excuse for why they wouldn't provide the satellite imagery, because
And still made
without
a
that,
rule.
I mean, they don't really have any proof for their claims. And in fact, all the evidence, as the article goes into, indicate that it was an air-to-air missile, not a ground-to-air missile.
Right.
And the Donetsk People's Army does not have an air force. It had to have been the Ukrainian Air Force if it was an air-to-air missile, and that's what the evidence from the crash site revealed. And there
But
were
that's
even
why they couldn't
gunshots.
allow the evidence.
Yeah, exactly.
Because if they saw the evidence, which was that it was air to air, followed up by, I think, some bullets,
Yeah.
which is crazy, like that literally assassinated the pilots in the cockpit, if I read it right. The Ukrainian rebels, if you want to call them that, could not have done that. Nobody even can make a claim that they would have had the capacity to do that. So they just made up this thing about Bukes, which they also didn't have the capacity to do that. But you could argue, yeah, they had some anti-aircraft stuff on the ground, but you can't say they had planes in the air.
Yeah, and there are witnesses who witnessed it in some of the villages, and they actually witnessed shooting taking place. Um,
That's right, because didn't one of
so,
the Ukrainian planes go down?
hmm
And I think I saw a video of that back in the day. I think there was smoke in the distance from
yeah,
that
like
plane going
there's
down.
a huge amount of evidence. There's forensic evidence from the crash scene. There's eyewitness, and it's not just one eyewitness. There are numerous eyewitnesses. There's a good documentary was made that I forget. I'd have to look up the name of the filmmaker, but that reveals some of the eyewitness testimony is in that documentary. He went there and interviewed people in the village, and they witnessed a plane shooting down, and there was evidence of another Ukrainian plane there. Um, and there are a lot of other fishy things like the flight path was moved very
Yes, that's
suspiciously.
crazy. Tell me
Yeah.
about that.
Well, I have to review the fine details. I can't remember every fine detail because I was summarizing like a huge amount of material.
Well, I'll tell you
But
what the article said. The article said
yeah,
that planes were not flying over that danger zone at all, and the MH17 flight path was not over that spot, but they were literally directed to fly over that spot from, I guess it was air traffic control or whatever, Ukrainian authorities that lured them into that spot. And there was evidence of that flight path in, I think it's like Flight Aware or Flight Tracker. And that evidence was altered later. Like the actual flight path that was in the record originally was changed to something that looked different later. I think, I mean, that is the summary
mhm,
that
yeah,
when you amalgamated everything into the article that you wrote. And I recall that, but I
yeah,
didn't realize that it was absolutely that there actually had been evidence that was altered.
yeah. I mean, this is a major crime and criminal operation and cover up that took place. Uh, and yeah, that the plane was altered to go into that territory, and they're also war game exercises. They timed it when they're war game exercises. And that's actually similar to 9/11, so it creates confusion and chaos, and people think it's part of the war game. There's planes flying there, so they can more easily carry out that operation, that criminal operation. And there was a clear political agenda. Yeah, and some of the people later got threatened. Some of the people who had, excuse me, who had knowledge of the air traffic controller, like one was threatened. Uh,
Carlos, the Spanish guy.
yeah,
I
exactly.
remember that story right at the time too. He came right out, and he what you mentioned was that he actually, I don't know how he would have known who was behind it, but he said it was the previous one of the, that, is it Yulia or Julia or whatever you call her, Timoshenko, who had been a president of Ukraine. She was a little bit sketchy. Everybody's always corrupt in a Ukraine. Like, suppose, I think every president you can look into, you can find like hearty evidence of corruption from Ukraine since the Soviet era. But she literally went to jail for it. And from what I recall, like when she came out, she was a fan favorite. And then when she came out, she was kind of nutty. So I wouldn't be surprised if she had shifting loyalties or just did whatever she had to do. But supposedly she was in on it with Avakov, who was some kind of, I don't know if he was the defense minister, I forget who he was, but they were supposedly in league with agents of Kolomoisky. Now, I don't know how Carlos would have known that, but I do remember at the time him saying his statements and that he was afraid for his life.
Yeah, and there are a number of one guy committed suicide. Another like went to Dubai to
Yes,
be involved in this operation. Yeah,
the pilots who were shooting down, supposedly shot down MH17, one of them ran off with the Ukrainian air traffic
yeah,
controller. They supposedly, right, went to Abu Dhabi or Dubai or whatever. And then the other pilot killed himself in 2018, which
yeah.
don't
You
even get
always
me
become a bit
started.
suspicious when there's a suicide.
Yes.
That they're trying to silence somebody. And if you've read into like the JFK assassination or any of these major deep events, there are a lot of deaths that usually accompany them. And I mean,
Yes.
in this case, like there's a clear political agenda. I mean, like the U.S. at this time and EU were just starting to apply the sanctions, so this gave really legitimacy. Oh, that Russia is this evil country. Look, they shot down an airplane. This really was a way to legitimize the sanctions. And this book by Kees Vanderpil opened me up to this. There was a deal in the works between Angela Merkel, and Putin about to better integrate the economies of Russia and Germany, and to go
Yes.
forward with gas deal, the
Yes.
Nord Stream pipeline. And this is what scared the United States, because they don't want to see, U.S. strategic planners don't want to see Germany and Russia unified,
For
and U.S.
100 years, that's been a fear.
Yeah, so they have to resort to criminal activity to try and block this alliance. Look at where Germany and Russia are today,
And
and
that
it
was
was
even touch and
these
go
kind of incidents.
all the way to the end. I mean, Merkel was not going for shutting down the Nord Stream 2 or Nord Stream whatever. She was not down for shutting down those pipelines. It seemed
Yeah,
to me they could not get her to do it. They had
I
to get
mean, it
that
was in
Olaf
her interest.
Scholz in there.
It's very clearly in Germany's interest
Yes.
to have done this. And I mean, Germany, the close proximity to Russia, Russia, the huge natural gas supplier.
And
So
Germany has
this
so
was like a
much
no-brainer. And
power.
somehow the U.S. has engineered it that Germany is against Russia. Now Germany is paying 4 times more for their gas, and it's caused a major energy crisis. So it has
And
not been good for Germany.
that's just the beginning, because what Germany did was it gave up its power. Merkel, I'm not a fan of hers or anything, but I've always been a little bit mystified by why she doesn't just get in line with the US, UK, whatever axis. But she just wouldn't. And I think now in retrospect, regardless of like her talking out of both sides of her mouth and saying that she's always been a liar or whatever, like with the Minsk agreement, but when I saw this guy Olaf Scholz or whatever, I forget what vowels in there, but he just rolled over, just seemed intimidated and completely capitulated to what is, I would say, and I think Pierre de Gaulle would say, is a US plot to undermine Europe. And that
Yes.
Germany has got so much power. It's the industrial powerhouse with Russia as the resource powerhouse. They have always been a threat to anybody who would compete with them for world hegemony. And I just think this German guy was an absolute dupe. They probably, finagled him to get elected in there. But I did not realize that they were on. Not only had Yanukovych cut the EU bond gas deal, or was working on that with, or the Russian one instead of EU was working on that, but that Germany was in the mix there with, it said a land for gas deal. Now that was new to me. What land? Do you know? Or do you recall that? It said a land for gas deal was in the
uh,
offing.
I'm not sure all the detail. Yeah, you'd have to read this book by Keith
Yeah, it's a whole book. I
Vanderpool.
know, I know.
But it was I mean, I think it was a mutually beneficial agreement, and Ukraine was involved as well. So it's kind of like a three-way agreement, and each side was getting something good. I mean, this is how I think diplomacy should work. I mean, each side is getting something out of the agreement and not sacrificing much. I mean, Ukraine is saying they're not going to join NATO. And in return, they're getting like write-offs for the bases in Crimea, and they're getting some subsidies from Russia. And Germany's getting the gas. I guess Russia's getting some land. So it's like a good deal for everybody. And so, how do you break this up? I mean, the U.S. can't have that. These countries are working well together peacefully and improving their economies together. So the U.S. has to do something drastic. They have to bomb an airplane and blame Russia and try and mobilize world opinion against Russia so that they try and isolate Russia.
Well,
And yeah, it's part of a war. Yeah, the Pierre de Gaulle pointed out in his speech that this is also a war on Europe because it's in Europe's interest to have good relations with Russia. They're in close geographic proximity and they can benefit from Russia's natural resources. And I mean, nobody wants a war. Now we're heading to a new world war, a possibly nuclear war. It's just awful for everybody. And it's just like gangster. The U.S. can't just live, with the world. I mean, they have to behave like gangsters out of greed, sheer greed. I mean, yeah, it's really the U.S. Natural gas producers in Texas who can make a killing by supplying Europe, and that seems to be the main beneficiaries of all this. And
well,
it's
a couple of things.
and
Yeah.
think of how many people had to die for this. I mean, it's just like hijacking the normal way of countries, dealing with each other in a positive way. It's
Yeah,
it's
for
just
money.
awful.
That's what bums me out so much. Like I can't even get my mind around that. And to think, and this theme has recurred and recurred, and I absolutely believe it's true. I think I kind of deduced it was true just by seeing how the pieces were moving, that we were sending over liquefied natural gas by tanker. And I think, have we had this conversation before? I used to for a couple of
Probably.
years. I was I used to be a banker, I used to be an investment banker, but before that, like when I was straight out of college, I worked in it was the petroleum metals and mining group at Citibank. So they just did regular commercial loans. But I would have to, like, if we had a loan out to something, I would have to just like read the stuff and write an annual report on like how their finances were and could they still pay the loan back and blah blah blah. It was not very glamorous, but I remember one of the companies had liquefied natural gas, and you have to build certain ports. You have to have double hulled ship. If even a drop of that stuff gets in between the hulls, it'll expand because liquefied is under a lot of pressure. And if it expands, it'll blow the whole thing up, which has happened. And I remember thinking, like, and I even see liquefied natural gas like in a truck. I'm like scared of it because liquefied natural gas is really unnatural. And when they're shipping it across, the amount of effort and cost it is to put it in that format. I mean, it's much, much better to just take it from the source and pipe it to the customer. And that's why, and in one of the articles I read of yours, it said like I think it was Pierre de Gaulle said it's seven to 8 or 9 or 10 times the price that you would pay for this cheap gas. I mean, for sometimes they flare gas, they just burn it like it's in the way. It's almost free sometimes. And that in order for the American companies to get those super high prices, they have to make the natural alternative impossible to get. But the one thing that really blew my mind in this article, which I had not seen before, and it was Samantha Power's big long crying story, whatever, it going hand in hand with this narrative that the Ukrainian rebels would not allow investigators onto the crash site, when we know it was the Ukrainian authorities who wouldn't allow it, because some of the Ukrainian investigators themselves said that. And one of the things, it was a very comprehensive article that you wrote. Uh, they said why the Ukrainians themselves kept us from really examining the site. And why would they do that? If they were confident it was Russian, they would want us there to gather all that evidence. So not only did they not allow them in there, they used it by supposedly there was a whistleblower, an Australian whistleblower, that Obama and them all were going to use that as an excuse to invade. They were had one of their plans was to get like 9,000 troops and invade the Donbass to put the rebellion down, that they called the rebellion. I would call it the resistance at the absolute least, because to gain access to the crash site. And that's just the kind of thing that they've been trying for so long to escalate. And they were going to take back Crimea. Do you remember that part?
Well, yeah, they had a whole war plan in place. I mean, I think this was going to be used as a pretext for war, and I think we have to look at this, in historical context, as you were saying at the beginning. This is kind of a first draft of history, and I mean, I think historian, of course, the victors will try and write history and obscure the reality, but there's usually a few. Often they call them revisionist historians who probe into the real truth, and I think this whole era we see. An era of U.S. empire in decline. And I think they view these false flags, although they've done this throughout U.S. history, going back to the sinking of the main ship in Havana Harbor to justify the U.S. invasion of Cuba and then the Philippines, which they'd blamed on Spain, sinking the Maine. And I think we've seen that like on steroid in this era. There were the false pretext about Libya and Gaddafi, feeding his troops Viagra. There was the fake chemical weapon attack by Bashir al-Assad in Syria.
Oh, yes, that was terrible. That's where Bellingcat comes in, right?
Yeah, and then there's this incident where they're blaming the Russians, but yet they're blocking the investigation and the all evidence pointing to Ukrainian Air Force jet. So it's part of a pattern. And they had, in Syria too, they had a plan for bombing Syria. And then Ukraine, what the Helmer book reveals is that there were, documents reveal, they had a plan to go to war. And I think they were ready to implement that plan. For some reason, they didn't go to all-out war, but they had a plan to send, thousands of troops in there. And yeah, Australia was part of the plan, and they had their own troops on ready for this. So this was like the false flag pretext to invade, to send U.S. forces. And it's taking longer, but now, I mean, the U.S. has provided billions of dollars in military aid to Ukraine, and they have U.S. personnel are on the ground in Ukraine, and now they're bringing Ukraine to Oklahoma this week to train with some of these weapon systems. So it's a slower process, but they had this design, I think, to use Ukraine as a base to attack Russia and to bog Russia down in eastern Ukraine. And this was the key pretext, just like the sinking of the main ship in the Spanish-American War, just like with the false claim of a sarin attack by Assad in Syria. So it's a formula that plays out, time and time again. But they're doing it like on steroid now. They're just like ramping up these operations. And there have been other false flags in the war, but this is a key one because this is a key period right after the Maidan coup where the public is not really following much about Ukraine. And I mean, the U.S. had good relations with Russia. Like Obama, when he started his second term, and Dmitry Medvedev was the president of Russia, he promoted a reset policy where they would reset and have good relations. And then suddenly that shifted in 2012, 2013. So they've got to mobilize public opinion. And this is a key incident for doing that. And it's clearly a false flag, and it's an atrocious one given that 300 people were killed, many children. It just shows how evil these people are.
This was one of the things that I found hard to sort through in the beginning. When I would watch the videos of that plane going down, there were people. I saw it. I don't know if you saw this because I don't know if you covered it at the time. I'm sure it's impossible to find now. But there were guys in khakis, whatever. You didn't see their faces, but they opened a trunk and took out a bunch of brand new passports and threw them around in at the crash site. And there were also more than one report. I haven't seen it now, but only back then. So this could be like weird, confusing disinformation, although the powers that be weren't as adept at flooding the zone with false information then as they are now, but that the bodies had seemed like some of the bodies were frozen, hadn't were like cadavers that weren't actually killed in the thing. And I was always really baffled by that. Like, did they take a plane that was full of people and shoot it down, or did they minimize the death toll but maximize the propaganda value by kind of loading the cargo plane with dead bodies? Like, that would have probably required the complicity of Malaysia Airlines, or at least the Schiphol airport is where it would have been. I know that's like that sounds a little crazier than stuff that you normally look into, but there was weirdly compelling testimony of that. Did you ever hear any of that?
Well, in the past, yeah, because for Covert Action magazine, yeah, I started developing this series on political assassination, and I looked into a number of plane crashes, like Paul Wellstone when he was killed, and Ron Brown was killed.
Oh my gosh, yeah,
And
that
there is a lot of manipulation
that was the
in
same
these
plane,
cases. Hmm.
right? That was Ron Brown. I think one of
That was
those
in
guys was
1994 in
right,
Croatia,
but they were the
or
head of
1996.
Parsons. One of them, the CEO of Parsons, which is a company that was founded by Jack Parsons, who I have a book about him called Sex and Rockets. Like, he was a Satan worshiper, and he established JPL via Caltech and like Pasadena Community College. Like, it was really weird. That plane crash had a lot of strange
Yeah.
elements to it.
Yeah, there are a lot of strange things. Like in that one, Brown, I think, was shot in the head. He was found that his cause of death was he was shot in the head. So after a plane crash, he may have survived. So yeah, it doesn't surprise me, having looked into some of these cases. What would seem to be fiction is actually, truth is stranger than fiction,
Yeah,
and
I
the
mean,
elaborate planning
Lockerbie.
that goes into this. And even
Lockerbie
if
was
you look.
another one that was highly suspicious. There was evidence that the CIA there was information on that plane that the CIA needed to get taken care of. Remember the plane crash where the entire Polish government was wiped out?
Mhm.
I mean,
Yeah,
that talk about political assassinations. I keep
yeah.
wanting to gear up to write articles for you.
Yeah, that would be great. I mean, if we could have you and other research, because I
I
know
need
the
to get my
Lockerbie
kids
case
off
is
to
very
school.
suspicious, and
Yeah.
that's been in the news recently when they indicted this Libyan after all these years with a new Libyan government in place. But that one, yeah, the official story of that one had fallen through long before. So yeah, I mean, I think all of these cases beg for more investigation, but yeah, you start to see a pattern, and you start to see that these are sophisticated criminal operations, and when they have militaries on their side, they can do a lot of manipulation of the crime scene. And I mean, even 9/11, like you're saying with the passport, if you look into 9/11, somehow the passport of Mohammed Atta survived the crash. It was just like sitting there on the ground. How would that be possible? So, I mean, there are people
Right.
manipulating these crime scenes, and these are really elaborate criminal operations with very sophisticated criminals who are very intelligent in their planning ability. But I mean, once you start researching it even just a little bit, you see that the official story never don't make sense, and it's amazing people just believe it because they don't. I guess they don't. It's like cognitive dissonance, or they don't have time to look into it. So the media just like they shout Russia and they give like one or two things, and people just believe it because they don't really have the time to read a book about it or really probe into it. I mean, you have if you spend a few hours, you'll start to question it, but you need a good couple hours. You need to read like at least a book or two, or spend like 3 4 hours researching on the internet. You'll start to question it, but most people are just going about their life. They're not going to look into it more than maybe a short 2 minute clip on the CNN. So that's all they need to make the majority of the public believe it's the Russians. Because one of
I
the
yeah.
documentaries I watched, like it was very probing research into what happened, and then but like and he was just interviewing people in Netherlands off the street, to get a sense of public opinion. They're like, who did this? They all said the Russian. It was all people from all walks of life. Said,
Right.
oh, that's the Russian. They
And
didn't
they
even have
think
to
they
think.
know. They don't say I don't know.
Yeah, they said
Right.
immediately, oh, the Russian did that, Putin. And these like they get a student, they get like a professor, a doctor, a lawyer, a businessman, all different classes of people, and they all said the Russians,
In
but none
English,
really knew anything about what happened.
they say it in English, like they only find people who speak English, so they're the ones who are highly propagandized or have interest in the West. I've always noticed that too.
Yeah.
But I will add to that I believe that there is a real psychic barrier that people put up that they have to get through to even begin to consider. And I had that, so I know. After I was on the radio for kind of like getting to the deeper truth, and I still was like 9/11. I was like, I don't think 9/11 was an inside job. You think I'm crazy? And I broke through that because I did so much research on the Boston Marathon bombing. Like, I just could not deny that the official story was absolutely not true, could not have been true. And that is when I started getting like some people like DMing me or whatever saying, "Hey, I wouldn't say positive. Like, that's the kind of stuff that can get you hurt." Like, what? So, but what I thought, so I remember not being willing to believe or even consider 9/11 as an inside job. I did absolutely no research on it, but it was because I didn't believe that the powers that be, like politicians or whatever, deep state or the media, could, not so much that they couldn't do it, but that they wouldn't do it. Like, I couldn't conceive of that different a morality even among the elite. And I think there is a profoundly, and it was actually referred to by Brzezinski in 1972 in the American the Technotronic era. He said it is an elite with such a fundamentally different value system that you can't even conceive of it. And I think that's the psychic barrier. You can't conceive that people who look just like you, who you believed in, who you voted for, would kill a bunch of Americans, would draft a bunch of bankers on the 86th floor for this, war in Iraq.
Yeah, I hear you. Yeah, and I mean, often they come across well. Like I've had that, with like Obama or Clinton, because I did a book on Obama, and now I plan to publish a book on Clinton. And like, I mean, they come across well on the TV screen, and they come across as kind of clean cut and wholesome and good, moral leaders. So people just can't fathom that that's just like a public persona, and that these could be really terrible people. Because if you interview people who knew them, or if you look into their background, like as I did, like I met some people who knew Obama at Harvard, and they said he's the worst guy, and he just like betrayed all the black students. And these are I met some black students at Harvard, and they called him Alabama, like he was just like a traitor to them. He was just out for his career, and they were trying to do stuff on campus like for black rights, and like he was not their ally, and they resented him. And it's worse, if you interview people in Chicago, some of the things he did, in Chicago politics, he was just not a good person, and he was corrupt in many ways. So, and then Clinton was a horrible human being who was a sexual predator who probably apparently had a trademark of biting the lips of women who he raped.
Oh
And
my
he lied, so constantly. It was both Obama and Clinton had background with the CIA, and did the most immoral thing that president, but they got away with it because they came across so well. And when you start accusing them and telling people, "Oh, this guy, no good. He's a liar. He should be in jail," they start to look at you funny. I mean, And a lot of
And you're a
people,
traitor. You're a party traitor. You can't.
yeah. And I don't know, yeah, they just can't fathom, like, they can admit like the Iraq War was bad, but when you start to like talk about 9/11 being a false flag, or that there's all kinds.
Because Obama covered it up. That's why they won't, they people expected Obama to reveal it. And when he didn't, they decided to just close ranks and let it go. But I felt like some people, that was their moment. But with it was probably well established by the time this was going down in 2014, the Ukraine stuff. That was Obama, like, well into his second term. So the writing was on the wall about him being no good, not what he pretended,
Yeah,
not the
but
guy who
most
should win
people
a
don't
Nobel
really
Peace
follow,
Prize.
like, Ukraine wasn't on the radar screen of most people.
Right.
They're focused more on domestic policy issues, and, like, the liberals, are worried about the extremism of the GOP and, like, cuts to, social programs, so they rally behind Obama, and they're not really, focused on what's going on. So they can get away with a lot there, and I think, yeah, they can slowly mobilize public opinion because, I wrote a book called "The Russians Are Coming Again." The first Cold War is tragedy, the second is farce. It was looking at the parallel between the original Cold War and new Cold War, and I was looking at the public opinion polls like around 2000, because when Putin first came into office, the U.S. and Russia had very good relations, and Putin was making overtures toward the United States. And like public opinion polls, they asked, you have a good impression of Russia, and you want good relation with Russia? And the majority of Americans said yes at that time, in the early 2000s. And then it shifted because of incidents like this. By 2016, 2018, a huge percentage of Democrats were saying that Russia was bad, and they thought they were a great threat, and you shouldn't have good relation with them, or they would support a more hostile policy. So there was a major shift in public opinion, and that's what the CIA calls psychological warfare, and they use incidents like this, and even, the evidence seems to show, set up would stoop to that level of evil, of downing a jet or coordinating it, and killing innocent children, so they can mobilize public opinion against Russia, because they've had these designs for years, because Putin was more nationalist leader than Boris Yeltsin, and he started to stand up for Russian interests and for more independent, sovereign Russia. And the U.S. elites, yeah, that class you're referring to, who think differently, all they want to do is get in. They see dollar bills in
Yeah.
Russia, and Russia has rich natural resources. They have gas, oil, nickel, uranium. So they want Boris Yeltsin. They want Navalny in there, so they could send in,
Right.
open up Russia's economy to looting by foreign interests. So Putin has to go, and they want to control the oil and gas in Central Asia. Putin, a stronger leader, will assert more Russian control over that, like in the Soviet days. So their agenda is to remove Putin. They've said this, and they've used every kind of manipulation to try and achieve this, and they've completely manipulated public opinion. But yeah, I think the MH17 incident is really a crucial incident, and that's why it's important to examine it. And it's a major crime. I would only hope that the culprits in this criminal act would be held accountable one day. They obviously were not in this farce of a trial in the Netherlands,
No.
but perhaps
True,
if more
true.
people scrutinize what happened, the criminals could be held accountable one day for the death of all those innocent people. And the war, I mean, ultimately, it's the highest crime, comparable to the Nuremberg crime of the Nazis, because they're waging aggressive war that could lead into a world or nuclear war. And that's the epitome of human evil from my point of view.
I agree with you. And I don't normally do this, but I wonder, this article I did not have time to read, but it really caught my eye, the $1 trillion silencer, and the subtitle is "The Military's Deep Penetration into All Aspects of American Life Has Hampered the Development of a Strong Anti-War Movement, and it at a time when it is desperately needed." Do you think you could take these last few minutes and just give the listeners a summary of that article? Is that fresh in your mind?
Sure,
Just the
yeah, and
gist
this
of it.
there's a good book that I was mainly reviewing by Joan Roloffs, published by Clarity Press. It's called The Trillion Dollar Silencer, and she asks, like, why, given what we've just been discussing, I mean, this war in Ukraine, the billions of dollars that are going there, is really not in the interest of the American public. It's not in the interest of the European public. It's not in the interest of anybody. Why is there not more mobilization against this or other military intervention like Syria, Libya, and all the money? I mean, the U.S. just passed, the Senate passed the NDAA. The military budget is approaching $1 trillion at a time when there's acute needs in the country. I mean, the education system's in crisis, the infrastructure is eroding. There are major needs domestically, a huge homeless population, and yet they're spending $1 trillion on weapons and war. Why are not more people opposing this? And I mean, the book has a simple answer: money. I mean, the military industrial complex. I mean, what Eisenhower warned about in 1960 has grown into an even greater cancer. The military industry buy off the politicians. They lobby for their interests, but even more so, yeah, she goes into how, in the local environment, like her home state is Massachusetts, how they spread their money in all the states and they set up bases in rural areas, so it becomes the lifeblood of that economy. In an otherwise depressed rural area that doesn't have much going for it economically, they'll set up a base there, and all of a sudden the region might flourish because they're all kind of side. You have all these soldiers on the base who train there, and they have to go out to eat, and they have to get a haircut, and so all kinds of store, and they have to buy stuff to furnish their home, and
And
so
civilians work on those plants at those bases too.
what's that?
Civilians work at those
Oh yeah,
bases too.
and I mean, like Oklahoma is a good case study where I live.
Yes.
There are a lot of military bases, and James Inhofe was very popular in Oklahoma because he inserted into a lot of the defense spending bills special, I guess, pork for Oklahoma, more refurbishment for Oklahoma bases, and he took care of Oklahoma in that way. And I mean, in a way, it sustained the Oklahoma economy. I mean, Oklahoma has oil, but that's and oil is tied to it because the military is a big supply. The oil companies supply the military, so it sustained many regions economically, and people, if their livelihood is dependent on it, they're not going to protest or join with an anti-war group or movement. And then she goes into how the military is very effective, like in in basically infiltrating the education system, whether through ROTC, whether it's universities, the research, more and more they're funding the research of a lot of professors, and so it's going to lead to more favorable references to the military, and they fund video games. They really target youth, and then they fund a lot of video games that kind of heroize the military and Hollywood
Definitely.
movies. And what else?
Sports.
They do so many different things. Like
Sports
they fund the
advertising.
Boy
They own
Scout. Yeah,
football.
yeah, they fund football and they fund good program for kid, like in these areas where they're the lifeblood of the community. They'll fund the Boy Scouts and programs for youth, and they fund a lot of STEM programs in schools and scholarships. So their reach is so wide that it's really it prevents the growth of an anti-war movement, and they suppress the news so that they portray, and like a lot of TV networks have former military generals or CIA. Often
Yeah.
their analysts, like MSNBC, is supposedly more liberal network, and so they control the narrative. And putting all those things together, you don't have an anti-war movement when it's really urgently needed, and it's in the interest of the American people not to spend uh, nearly $1 trillion when it's like over 50% of the budget goes to that. I mean, we have the debt, and and we have major needs in our communities, like in education, healthcare, environment, and infrastructure, and that's where the money should be going to improve the communities, but instead it's going to the military, but there's no pushback.
In the book, or it's a compilation of essays, The Crisis of Democracy by, it was one of the first, I think it might have been one of the first publications by the Trilateral Commission, which was Zbigniew Brzezinski's um, brainchild with the Kissinger's Rothschilds, whatever, with Kissinger and the Rothschilds, where he got like 8 different thinkers from different regions to talk about the crisis of democracy in the wake of the Vietnam War protests, which I can never get my mind around this, because if you look at like the Students for Democracy or whatever, Gloria Steinem, and people who might have been prominent in anti-war stuff, they were also like kind of CIA fronts. So I'm not fully, I don't fully understand it. Maybe you can illuminate
Oh, yeah,
that.
and actually, I want to add that
Yeah.
the one thing that her book goes into very well is the growth of these corporate foundations. Yeah, after because of the strength of the Vietnam War movement, they tried to co-opt the anti-war movement. They did it very effectively by increasingly funding foundations. The Rockefeller, the Ford Foundation. I mean, there are many of these foundations, Gates Foundation. Then even some military contractors set up their own foundation, like Bechtel Foundation. And what they did was they did sponsor like community projects, but they made sure to that the focus was never on anti-war activism or challenging like the political economic order, the class structure. It was on more like local projects, and sometimes it would serve the interests of the needs of the military. So yeah, these foundations became very, very influential. And then I think the abolishing the draft was crucial because one main reason that there
Yes.
was a
That's what my
huge
mother
protest.
says. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, is because people, didn't want to go to Vietnam. Middle class to upper class people were had to serve in the military in the Vietnam, and they didn't want to go, and they were influential in organizing the protests. Once you abolish the draft, you make it an all volunteer force. It's mostly the working class, and they're in kind of desperate, precarious position where they're joining the military for a career.
And you have
And they don't have
mercenaries.
other option. Yeah, they're not going to protest, and people, the average person, then tunes out because, or the middle class person just pursues his college degree and his professional career and lives the good life, but he doesn't necessarily have to pay too much attention to these foreign wars because his ass is not on the line, so he doesn't pay as much attention. He doesn't have a personal stake in it. And they use these fancy drone technology and the like that they don't have to have that many personnel like what we're seeing in Ukraine, and they use it by they carry out wars by proxy. So they've been very effective, yeah, in sustaining American imperial power without having to use the manpower and bring back the draft. So that's the number one reason I think there's no anti-war movement. And then there's these other factors that I was discussing before. And so it's really a paltry anti-war movement. And sadly, many people who at one point considered themselves anti-war activists have supported the war in Ukraine because they blame Russia for invading Ukraine, but they're often not well attuned to the whole backstory and how Russia was provoked. And they buy into the myth that the CIA advance of an unprovoked Russian invasion, which clearly it was not. So they've been, a whole segment of the anti-war movement has been silent or supporting military aid to Ukraine, and that's a big issue now. Should be a big focus of the anti-war movement, but they're not much of a movement. So
Well, this is where it comes in, and I have similar problems from the right, that the like Trump silences the libertarian, the Ron Paul movement. Like they take heroes within one side or the other, and they use them to silence their own side. I actually made a term, the contrary law of democracy. Like the thing you're afraid of the most can only be delivered to you by someone on your side. Because if it was on the other side, everybody would get together and resist it. So I really blame Obama for silencing the anti war left that was reemerging after 9/11, also for the drone stuff. And even with Biden and Ukraine, I think it goes even a little bit deeper than what we were saying, in that I anticipated when Trump was getting impeached for not giving money to Ukraine that it would just de facto become, it's probably not the right use, but it would just automatically become a left thing to want to give money to Ukraine. Like Trump owned, for the right, that Ukraine, shouldn't be supported, and then and by bringing the wars from the left, that's how you silence those who are naturally kind of anti-war. And I know we're getting on an hour, and I will just wrap it up. But the thing that the Crisis of Democracy said to do, recommended, which the people who wrote the essays objected to this, but Brzezinski said, "Oh, so obviously we all agree. If people are all dependent on institutions that are not democratic, they will not go out and protest. If they work for the government, they're not going to resist the government." But so we are getting on past that hour. I love your time. I appreciate it so much. I love your knowledge. I love what you write. I'm addicted to your articles. And you really are prolific. Like, I used to be able to keep up. I can barely keep up now.
Yeah, I'm
But
gonna have to slow down. It was taking its toll, but
yes, I'm sure you're absolutely super busy. But just so that I can let you get
there's
a
so
word
much
in.
to write about, and like so
Yeah.
much that kind of scratches your head, that it's almost like therapy to sit at the computer, because otherwise you just want to like break the TV screen, or like
Yes.
punch a wall, or like do something
And
destructive. So
you're an academic. Like, you are trained for this. This is your profession. Like, this is your calling. This is what you're good at. So it's really, that's what I love about your work, and how much I appreciate it. I do hope people support. You want to just rattle off real quick where people should go to find your stuff, and anything else they need to do to support you?
yeah, they can go to www.covertactionmagazine.com. And they could also go to my website at www.jeremykuzmarov.com.
Oh, right. Yes. Excellent. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Jeremy. This is Monica Perez, broadcasting live from my mother's house. As you can see, if you're watching, hopefully you can't tell if you're listening. So it has been super fun talking to you. Talk to you next time, Jeremy. Thank you so much. This has been Deep Dives.
Thanks. It's been great.